That'll teach you to respect the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, Mr. Miller. Karen's voice, a smug, grating thing that always sounded like it was complaining about the temperature, cut through the quiet morning air. I stood there frozen for a half second, my hand still on the handle of the irrigation headgate I'd been about to adjust. She was standing on the far side of my property line, a place she had no right to be, beside the ancient stone-lined ditch that carried life-giving water to my 10 acres. In her hand, she held a gallon-sized plastic jug, the kind that held cheap laundry bleach, and she was just lowering it, empty. The acrid chemical smell hit me a moment later, a poisonous ghost that drifted over the scent of damp earth and budding apple blossoms. A wave of cold, sharp fury washed over me, in the kind I hadn't felt since my last tour in Afghanistan. My land, my water, my future, and this woman in her pastel pink tracksuit and oversized sunglasses was poisoning it with a triumphant smirk plastered on her face, as if she'd just won a prize for best petunias. The water in the ditch, usually a clear, quick-moving ribbon, was already turning cloudy, a sickly, milky swirl making its way inexorably toward the root systems of the 200 heirloom apple trees I had sunk my entire life savings and a sizable chunk of my soul into. If you think that's insane, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me your own HOA nightmare in the comments below. I want to know where you're watching from, because this kind of crazy knows no zip code. Now let me tell you how we got here, and more importantly, how I made sure she paid for every last drop. It all started not with malice, but with a search for peace. After 12 years as an Army combat engineer, dealing with things a hell of a lot more explosive than an HOA president, I wanted out. Not just out of the service, but out of the noise, the concrete, the constant hum of a world that never seemed to sleep. My wife, Sarah, a high school science teacher with a love for botany that bordered on obsession, shared that dream. We wanted land, not a half-acre suburban plot with a chemically perfect lawn, but real land. Land with history, with character, with enough space to breathe. We found it in a small, unincorporated valley just outside a town that was slowly being swallowed by suburbia. 10 acres, a rustic but solid old farmhouse, and a deed that came with water rights from Miller Creek. Dating back to 1908, that was the real prize. The irrigation ditch, which the locals just called the Cut, was more than a feature. It was a legal and historical artery. It tapped into the creek a mile upstream, flowed through my property, and discharged back into the creek a half-mile downstream, a grandfathered-in right that predated almost every law on the state's books. It was the reason the original homesteader had been able to plant an orchard here a century ago, and it was the reason I could do the same. The problem was the creeping tide of suburbia had brought with it the Oak Hollow Estates Homeowners Association, a bureaucratic hydra that had annexed the surrounding area in a bid for more dues-paying members. When we bought the property, our realtor had assured us that our parcel was exempt from most of the cosmetic covenants due to its agricultural zoning and pre-existing structures, a fact I had confirmed with my own lawyer before signing. But that little detail was lost on Karen Brewster, the newly elected power-infatuated president of the HOA. Our first meeting was a week after we moved in. She arrived with a welcome basket filled with cheap crackers, a bottle of saccharine sweet white Zinfandel, and a 3-inch binder containing the CC and Rs. She was a large woman carrying her weight with an air of imposing authority, her eyes scanning our property with a look of undisguised disapproval. She pointed at my F250, my workhorse truck, parked near the barn. "Commercial vehicle," she announced, "are to be kept in a garage. Section 4, paragraph B." I just nodded, smiling faintly. Good to know. The barn predates the HOA by about 80 years, but I'll keep that in mind. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "And the fence line," she gestured toward the old split-rail fence that marked my northern boundary, "is not on the approved list of fencing materials. We require white vinyl or wrought iron." I looked at the weathered, beautiful old fence, a piece of the property's history. "That fence is staying, Karen." The use of her first name, without the honorific she clearly expected, made her lips tighten. That was the first shot fired in a war I didn't even want to fight. The peace I'd sought was already being threatened, not by mortars or IEDs, but by petty tyranny in a pink tracksuit. And the battleground I would soon learn was going to be that simple, elegant, century-old ditch of flowing water. The initial skirmishes were, in retrospect, almost comical in their absurdity. The first official violation notice arrived a month after the Welcome Basket incident. It was a crisp, professionally printed letter with the Oak Hollow Estates logo embossed at the top, informing me of a $50 fine for unregulated lawn height. I looked out at my property. About 2 acres around the house were kept as a traditional lawn, which I mowed weekly. The other 8 acres were a mix of orchard, pasture, and a designated wildflower meadow that Sarah and I were cultivating to support local pollinators. The letter, I realized, was referring to the meadow. I wrote a polite, concise letter back, citing the agricultural zoning of my property, the county's own incentives for pollinator habitats, and respectfully stating that the HOA's jurisdiction did not extend to my pasture management practices. I included a copy of the relevant county ordinance and a photograph of a bee on a coneflower. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. It was like I had corrected a teacher in front of the class. Karen's pride was wounded and her resolve hardened. The fines started coming weekly, each one for a new, more ridiculous infraction. My mailbox, a sturdy rural-style box that had served the previous owners for 20 years, was non-compliant with aesthetic standards. The small vegetable garden Sarah had planted was an unapproved agricultural installation. My decision to repaint the barn in a traditional, historically accurate red was a violation of the approved color palette. Each time I would respond with the same calm, methodical precision. I'd send a registered letter back to the HOA board, citing my property's legal exemptions, quoting their own bylaws back to them when they contradicted themselves, and keeping a meticulous file of all correspondence. I scanned every letter, every envelope, every receipt from the post office. In the Army, we had a saying, proper prior planning prevents piss-poor performance. I was applying the same principle to suburban warfare. Documentation was my ammunition. I tried to handle it through official channels, requesting a meeting with the full HOA board. I wanted to believe that Karen was just one bad apple, that the other board members, a retired dentist and a real estate agent, were reasonable people. The meeting was a farce. It was held in Karen's living room, which was decorated in a suffocating style of beige on beige, with motivational quotes and swirling fonts on every wall. She ran the meeting like a drill sergeant, cutting me off, misrepresenting my points, and treating the other 2 board members like her personal secretaries. They nodded along, their expressions ranging from bored to intimidated. "Mr. Miller," Karen said, her voice dripping with condescension, "the rules are the rules. They exist to protect our property values and maintain a certain standard. Your rustic aesthetic is dragging the whole neighborhood down." I looked her dead in the eye. "My property is a farm, Karen. It's been a farm since before this neighborhood was a blueprint. My rustic aesthetic is called history, and my property values are my business, not yours." The dentist, a man named Arthur, he cleared his throat nervously. "Now let's keep things civil. Karen is just trying to uphold the standards we all agreed to." "I didn't agree to them," I said, my voice low and steady. "My deed predates your association. My exemptions are legally recorded. You are overstepping your authority." That was when Karen's focus shifted from the trivial to the vital. She saw she couldn't win on the small stuff, so she went for the jugular. She went for my water. "That ditch," she said, the word dripping with disgust. "It's an eyesore. It's a safety hazard for the children who play nearby. It's a breeding ground for mosquitoes." I felt that cold anger again, but I kept my voice even. "It's a legally deeded irrigation channel. It's been here for over 100 years. It is the sole source of water for my orchard." "It's an open sewer," she snapped. "And it violates Section 7, which prohibits standing water features that are not professionally installed and chlorinated, like a swimming pool." "It's not standing water," I countered, my patience wearing dangerously thin. "It's a flowing waterway, part of the Miller Creek watershed. Interfering with it is a violation of state law, not just your little rule book." She just smiled, a thin, predatory smile. "We'll see about that, Mr. Miller. We will see." I left that meeting knowing the fight was about to escalate. She wasn't just a petty tyrant anymore. She was a direct threat to my livelihood. That night, I went online and ordered 4 high-definition, night vision security cameras. I installed one on the barn overlooking the fields, one on the house covering the driveway, and 2 more strategically positioned to give me full, very overlapping coverage of the entire length of the irrigation ditch as it crossed my property. I wasn't going to be paranoid. I was going to be prepared. The peace I had come here for felt like a distant memory. Now it was about defending my ground. The letters about the ditch started arriving with the punctuality of a Swiss train. They were no longer simple fine notices. They were formal demands, drafted with language that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Cease and desist," the first one read in bold capital letters. It demanded I immediately commence efforts to fill and remediate the unapproved water channel. It cited the same bogus Section 7 about standing water and added a new, equally irrelevant clause about unauthorized landscape alterations. The fine attached was no longer a paltry $50. It was $1,000, and with a threat of a lien being placed on my property if it went unpaid. I responded with my now standard protocol, a registered letter. This time, however, I had my lawyer, Marcus, draft it. Marcus was a guy I'd served with in the 3rd Infantry Division. He traded his combat boots for wingtips, but hadn't lost an ounce of his fight. His letter was a work of art, a masterpiece of polite, legal devastation. It methodically dismantled Karen's claims, citing my 1908 water rights, state statutes on historic waterways, and case law regarding HOA overreach. It concluded with a sentence that was pure Marcus. Be advised that any attempt to interfere with our client's vested water rights, either physically or through coercive administrative action, will be met with immediate and vigorous legal remedy, seeking both injunctive relief and punitive damages. We sent it not just to the HOA's general mailbox, but to Karen's home address and the addresses of the other 2 board members, Arthur the dentist and Brenda the realtor. I wanted them to know this wasn't a game. I wanted them to feel the weight of what Karen was doing. For a few weeks, there was silence. The violation notices stopped. I allowed myself a flicker of hope that Marcus's letter had done the trick, that Karen had finally consulted a real lawyer who had explained to her the concept of screwing around and finding out. I should have known better. Power addicts don't back down. They just change tactics. One Saturday morning, I was outside checking the graphs on my young apple trees when a county code enforcement truck pulled up my driveway. The officer, a retired-looking man named Henderson, got out holding a clipboard. "Morning," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Got a complaint about an illegal water diversion and a potential public health nuisance." I knew instantly who had made the call. "Let me guess," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. "The complaint came from a Ms. Karen Brewster?" Henderson's face gave it away. He sighed. "Look, man, I just have to follow up. Someone reports a potential violation. I have to come out and look. Can you show me this ditch they're talking about?" I spent the next hour walking Henderson along the entire length of the cut. I showed him the head gate where it diverted from Miller Creek, well outside the HOA's jurisdiction. I showed him my framed, century-old water rights document, which I'd brought out from the house. And I explained that the water was constantly flowing, not standing, and that its movement prevented any mosquito issues. Henderson was a reasonable guy. He took notes, measured the flow rate with a simple float test, and looked at the discharge point where the water rejoined the creek. "Honestly, Mr. Miller," he said, clicking his pen, "this looks like one of the cleanest, most well-maintained private irrigation systems I've ever seen. The complaint mentions stagnant, foul-smelling water. This is crystal clear." He shook his head. "We get these calls sometimes, people using my office to settle neighborhood disputes. I'll file my report. It'll say, 'No violation found,' but she'll probably just call again next week." He was right. The following week, it was a representative from the state's Department of Fish and Wildlife, following up on an anonymous tip about me illegally damming a creek and disrupting fish passage. I gave him the same tour. He was even more impressed than the code enforcement officer. "This is a textbook example of a beneficial, non-consumptive use diversion," he told me. "The screen on your head gate prevents any fish from entering the ditch, and the flow is less than 5% of the creek's total volume. You're not just compliant, you're exemplary. He too promised to file a case closed report. The harassment was failing. Every official channel she tried to use against me ended up vindicating me. The system, for once, was working. But with each failure, I could feel Karen's frustration mounting. It was no longer just about the rules for her, it was personal. I was the one person in her little kingdom who refused to bend the knee, and she couldn't stand it. The cameras I'd installed became my silent sentinels. Every night, I'd spend 15 minutes reviewing the day's footage. Most of it was just deer nibbling at the clover in the pasture, or the wind rustling the leaves in the orchard. But occasionally, I'd catch it. Karen's white SUV driving slowly past my property line. Sometimes she'd stop for a minute, just sitting there staring. It was unnerving. She wasn't just an annoyance anymore. She was an obsession. The calm before the storm came in the form of a final, desperate-looking legal letter from an attorney the HOA had clearly hired from the bottom of the barrel. It was full of bluster and threats, but it was legally flimsy, citing irrelevant case law from other states and fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of my water rights. Marcus and I laughed as we read it over the phone. "This is a scare tactic, Jack," he said. "They know they have no legal leg to stand on, so they're hoping this guy's letterhead is enough to make you flinch." "I don't flinch," I told him. He knew that. We sent one last, final letter in response. It was short and to the point. It stated our position was unchanged and that any further communication should be considered part of a prelude to litigation. Then for 2 weeks, nothing. The quiet was more unsettling than the letters had been. It was the silence of a predator gathering itself to strike. And then came that Tuesday morning. I woke up just before dawn, as I always do. The air was cool and still. I went to the kitchen to make coffee, and as I looked out the window that overlooked the orchard, I saw her, a bulky figure in a pink tracksuit, moving along the far side of the ditch. It was Karen. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed my phone, switched it to video, and moved silently to the back door, using the corner of the house as cover. I zoomed in. She was holding a white plastic jug. She unscrewed the cap and, without a moment's hesitation, she upended it, pouring a thick, glugging stream of liquid directly into the flowing water of my irrigation ditch. She tossed the empty jug into the bushes on her side of the property line and stood there for a moment, hands on her hips, a look of profound, ugly satisfaction on her face. That's when she saw me stepping out from behind the house. My phone held steady. She was recording her every move. And that's when she delivered that smug, self-incriminating line. "That'll teach you to respect the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, Mr. Miller." She had no idea. She thought she was teaching me a lesson about HOA rules. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that she had just committed a federal crime. The war was over. The hunt had just begun. My first instinct was pure, unadulterated rage. I wanted to sprint across the field, leap the ditch, and what? My training kicked in, overriding the primal anger. A combat engineer doesn't charge headfirst into a minefield. You stop, you assess, you plan. Shouting at her would accomplish nothing except giving her the satisfaction of a reaction. The most powerful weapon I had at that moment was the silent, with damning evidence I was recording on my phone. I lowered the phone slowly, my face an unreadable mask. I didn't say a word. I just stared at her. Her smug smile faltered for a second, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She hadn't expected silence. She'd expected a screaming match. I turned deliberately and slowly and walked back toward my house, leaving her standing there in the dawn light, suddenly looking less like a triumphant victor and more like a confused trespasser. The moment I was inside, the calm shattered and the mission began. "Sarah," I called, my voice tight, "get dressed. We have a problem." While she came downstairs, rubbing sleep from her eyes, I was already in action. I shut off the main head gate from the creek, stopping any more clean water from flowing into the contaminated ditch and pushing the poison further downstream. Every drop in that ditch was now evidence. Next, I went to the garage and pulled out my emergency preparedness kit. I had sample collection vials, sterile gloves, and evidence tape. This was a whole different kind of EOD. I pulled on the gloves and went back to the ditch. The smell of chlorine was overpowering now, a chemical blight on the morning. The water was visibly cloudy. I took 3 separate water samples from different points along the ditch. One just downstream from where she'd poured the bleach, one in the middle of the orchard, and one just before the first row of apple trees. I sealed each vial, labeled it with the precise time and location, and placed it in a cooler. Then I took soil samples from the banks of the ditch and from the base of the nearest apple tree, a beautiful little honeycrisp sapling that was already showing signs of leaf curl from the chemical shock. Each sample was bagged and tagged. The whole process took 20 minutes, and I did it with the methodical precision of clearing a bomb. This was my crime scene. While I worked, Sarah was on the phone, her voice a low, urgent murmur. She was a science teacher. She knew who to call. She found a certified environmental testing lab in the state capital, 2 hours away. She explained the situation, the need for a legal chain of custody, and the urgency. They told us if we could get the samples to them by noon, they could expedite the analysis for an extra fee. Pay it, I told her, without hesitation. And the empty bleach jug Karen had tossed into the bushes was next. I photographed it from every angle before using a pair of tongs to place it in a large evidence bag. Her fingerprints were probably all over it. This wasn't just about my apples anymore. This was about a deliberate act of destruction. My next call was to Marcus. I sent him the video file first, then called him. He was silent for a long time after watching it. When he finally spoke, his voice was grim. Jack, she's done. I mean, truly, monumentally done. Talk to me, Marcus. What have we got? Okay, first the obvious. Destruction of property, trespassing, maybe even agricultural vandalism, depending on state statutes. That's the small stuff. The big one, the really big one, is the Clean Water Act. The ditch, I said, my mind racing ahead. Nah, it discharges back into Miller Creek. Exactly, Marcus affirmed. Miller Creek is a designated water of the United States. It's a tributary to the North River, which is navigable. That means it's under federal jurisdiction. By dumping a pollutant into a waterway that feeds a federally protected water source, she didn't just violate an HOA bylaw, she likely committed a felony under Title 33 of the U.S. Code. We're talking EPA Criminal Investigation Division. We're talking federal charges. The satisfaction I felt was cold and sharp as a razor. This was no longer a neighborhood squabble. Karen, in her arrogant quest to control the color of my mailbox, had blundered into the crosshairs of the federal government. So what's the play, I asked. We don't go to the local cops, Marcus said immediately. They'll kick it around. Why maybe charge her with misdemeanor mischief, and it'll get lost in the system. We don't go to the HOA. We go over everyone's head, but we do it carefully. We need the lab results first. We need irrefutable scientific proof of what she put in that water and at what concentration. Once we have that, we build a case file that a U.S. attorney can't ignore. He laid out the plan. I would drive the samples to the lab myself to maintain the chain of custody. He would start drafting a formal complaint and a detailed report to be submitted to the regional EPA office. We would not, under any circumstances, tip our hand to Karen or the rest of the HOA board. We would let her think she had gotten away with it. Let her believe her little act of spite had worked, that my apple trees were dying and I was defeated. Her arrogance was now our greatest asset. Before I left for the lab, I did one last thing. I walked the perimeter of my property, my eyes scanning for any other potential evidence. And that's when I found them. Tucked into the bushes near the road, I found 2 more empty bleach jugs, weathered and partially covered in leaves. They were the same brand. She'd done this before. This wasn't her first time. It was just the first time I had caught her. The rage came back, hot and blinding, but I pushed it down. Rage was a fuel, but it wasn't a strategy. Strategy was what won wars. I bagged the old jugs as well, more evidence for the pile. As I got in my truck, with the cooler of samples on the passenger seat, Sarah came out and handed me a thermos of coffee. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury. Get her. Aunt Jack, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Get her for good. I put my hand over hers. She's already gotten, I said. She just doesn't know it yet. The 2-hour drive to the lab was the longest of my life. I didn't listen to the radio. I just drove. the quiet hum of the engine a backdrop to the storm in my mind. Karen hadn't just poured bleach in a ditch. She had tried to poison my dream, the peaceful future I had fought so hard to build for my family. She had mistaken my desire for peace for weakness. It was a common mistake people made with veterans. They forget that behind the calm lies a discipline forged in chaos and a commitment to mission accomplishment that is absolute. My new mission was simple: justice, and I would see it through to the end. The lab was an unassuming brick building in a drab industrial park, but inside it was a temple of science. A technician in a white coat met me at the reception, already briefed by Sarah's call. He took the cooler, checked my ID, and had me sign a series of chain of custody forms that tracked the samples from my hands to theirs. "We'll run a full panel," he said, his expression serious. "We'll test for chlorine, sodium hypochlorite, pH levels, and any other volatile organic compounds. The expedited results should be ready in 48 hours. We'll email you a certified PDF." I paid the hefty fee without flinching. It was the best money I'd ever spent. The drive home was different. The rage had cooled into a hard, dense certainty. Now it was a waiting game. Per Marcus's instructions, I was to act defeated. I needed Karen to feel secure in her victory. That evening, I made a show of it. I took a shovel and walked out to the ditch, in full view of the road and, presumably, Karen's watchful eyes. I didn't do any real work. I just stood there for a while looking down at the now still contaminated water. My shoulders slumped. I poked at the bank with the shovel, sighed dramatically, and walked back to the house. It was theater, and I hoped she was enjoying the show. The next day I saw her drive by, slower than usual. She didn't look at me, but I could feel her gaze. There was a smug little tilt to her head. The performance was working. While I waited for the lab results, I started the second phase of Marcus's plan: reconnaissance. He'd told me that while the federal case was our trump card, building a parallel case against the HOA itself for negligence and harassment would be crucial. "One, we need to show a pattern of abuse," he'd said. "We need to prove that Karen wasn't just a rogue actor, but the leader of a corrupt system, and that the board was complicit." I had never been a particularly social neighbor. I kept to myself, waved when I drove by, but that was about it. It was time to change that. I started with Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who lived 2 houses down. I'd seen HOA violation notices stuck to her door before. I baked a loaf of Sarah's sourdough bread and walked over, using the pretense of introducing myself properly. She was a sweet, frail woman with kind eyes and a garden full of bird feeders. "It's lovely to finally meet you, Jack," she said, inviting me in for iced tea. After a few minutes of pleasantries, I gently broached the subject. I couldn't help but notice you've had some trouble with the HOA, I said. Her face clouded over. "Oh, that Karen," she sighed. "She's a terror, a complete terror." For the next hour, Mrs. Gable told me her story. Karen had been fining her $25 a week for her bird feeders, claiming they attracted vermin and were unaesthetic. Mrs. Gable had lived in that house for 40 years, long before the HOA existed, and her late husband had built those feeders for her. She told me if I didn't pay the fines and take them down, she'd put a lien on my house. Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling. "I'm on a fixed income. I've been paying it. I don't know what else to do." I felt a fresh surge of anger, this time on behalf of this gentle old woman. "Mrs. Gable," I said softly, "Awe, would you be willing to share those violation notices and proof of payment with me? I'm working with an attorney. We think there's a pattern of illegal harassment, and we might be able to help." Her eyes filled with tears. "You would do that?" She disappeared into a back room and returned with a shoebox overflowing with letters and canceled checks. A meticulously kept record of the extortion. "Take it," she said. "Please, just make her stop." My next visit was to the Sanchez family, who lived across the street. They were a young couple with 2 small children. I'd seen their kids playing on a brightly colored plastic playset in their backyard. I'd also seen Karen talking to them in their driveway once, her posture aggressive and their faces stricken. I caught Mr. Sanchez while he was mowing his lawn. I introduced myself and mentioned I was having some issues with the HOA myself. That was all it took. The floodgates opened. Karen had been harassing them for months about the playset, claiming it violated the natural color palette of the neighborhood. She demanded they paint it beige or dark green. "We told her it's for our kids," he said, his voice full of frustration. "It's a plastic playset. You can't just paint it. She's fining us $100 a month. We tried to appeal to the board, but they just rubber-stamped her decision." Brenda, the realtor on the board, told my wife off the record that if we made a fuss, Karen would find other violations to fine us for until we moved. He told me about another family that had been forced to resod their entire lawn because Karen didn't like the specific species of fescue they had used. He told me about a gay couple who were constantly being cited for excessive garden decorations during Pride Month. The story was the same everywhere I went. Karen ruled by fear, using the HOA's power to enforce her own narrow, bigoted vision of a perfect neighborhood. She targeted the vulnerable, the elderly, young families, anyone who was different. The other board members, Arthur and Brenda, were either too scared or too self-interested to stand up to her. They were complicit in her reign of terror. By the end of the day, I had statements from 5 other families, along with copies of their fines and correspondence. And I had a mountain of evidence showing a clear, undeniable pattern of abuse, selective enforcement, and financial intimidation. I scanned every single document and uploaded it to a secure cloud folder that I shared with Marcus. He called me that evening, his voice buzzing with energy. "This is gold, Jack. Pure gold. We can tear this HOA apart from the inside out. We can sue them into oblivion for breach of fiduciary duty, harassment, and a dozen other things. The board members will be personally liable." The email from the lab arrived at 9:17 a.m. the next morning. The subject line was simple: Certified Lab Report, Case Number 734-B. I opened the PDF. It was 20 pages of dense, scientific data, charts, and graphs. I scrolled to the summary page. The results were devastating. The primary contaminant was, as expected, sodium hypochlorite. But the concentration was shocking. The lab estimated that at least a full gallon of concentrated industrial bleach had been dumped into the ditch. The pH of the water had spiked to over 12, a level that was highly caustic and lethal to almost all aquatic life and plant matter. But there was a kicker, something I hadn't expected. The report also detected elevated levels of mercury and lead. The technician had included a note: "These heavy metals are not typically found in commercial bleach. They are often present in older, unregulated industrial-grade chemical agents. The specific signature of these contaminants suggests a source that is not standard household bleach." I thought of the other 2 empty jugs I'd found, old and weathered. Karen hadn't just used laundry bleach. She had used something old, something nasty. Something she probably had sitting in her garage for years. Something that turned a serious crime into an environmental catastrophe in miniature. This report was the kill shot. It was irrefutable. It was scientific. It was the nail for Karen Brewster's coffin. I forwarded the report to Marcus. His reply came back in minutes, all caps: "We got her. It's time to load the cannon." With the lab report in hand, the chess game entered its final phase. Marcus's plan was brilliant in its simplicity and its cruelty. It wasn't enough to just hand the evidence over to the authorities. That would bring justice, yes, but it wouldn't dismantle the system of fear Karen had built. It wouldn't empower the neighbors she had terrorized. To do that, we needed to expose her. We needed a public execution, metaphorically speaking. And the perfect venue was the upcoming annual HOA meeting. "She feels untouchable in that room," Marcus explained over the phone. "It's her throne room. She controls the agenda. She controls the microphone. We're going to use her own arrogance against her. We're going to let her build her own gallows, and then we're going to hand her the rope." The first step was to create the official evidence package for the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division in the U.S. Attorney's Office. It was a work of art. Marcus compiled everything into a thick, spiral-bound report. It included my sworn affidavit, the high-definition video of Karen dumping the bleach, stills from the video with timestamps, the full certified lab report with the heavy metals highlighted, copies of my 1908 water rights deed, on topographical maps showing the ditch's connection to Miller Creek, and a summary of the relevant federal statutes under the Clean Water Act that had been violated. He also included the shoebox of evidence from Mrs. Gable and the statements from the other families, not as part of the federal complaint, but as supporting documentation to establish a pattern of malicious intent. This shows motive, he said. It paints a picture of a woman obsessed with power who escalated her harassment to a criminal act when she didn't get her way. We made 3 copies of this binder, one for the EPA, one for the U.S. Attorney, and one for me. But we didn't send them yet. That was the crucial part of the trap. The next step was to bait the hook. We drafted a formal letter to the HOA board, care of Karen Brewster. It was deceptively mild. It stated that I had conclusive evidence of a deliberate act of property damage and chemical contamination of my irrigation ditch, and that I was formally requesting time on the agenda at the annual meeting to present this evidence to the community in the interest of resolving the matter internally before pursuing external legal action. It was a bluff, but a calculated one. We knew she would never allow it. The phrase "resolve the matter internally" was designed to make her feel powerful, to make her believe I was coming to her, hat in hand. We knew her ego wouldn't be able to resist the opportunity to publicly humiliate me one last time. We sent the letter via registered mail and waited. Her response came 3 days later, just as we predicted. It was a curt, dismissive letter, signed by her. "Dear Mr. Miller," it read, "the board has received your request. As the agenda for the annual meeting is already full, we will not be able to accommodate your presentation. Furthermore, the board considers the matter of your non-compliant water feature to be closed, pending a vote by the homeowners to levy the necessary fines and liens to ensure compliance. We trust you will be in attendance." It was perfect. She had not only denied my request, but had doubled down, telegraphing her exact plan. She was going to use the meeting to railroad a vote against me. She thought my letter was a sign of weakness. She was walking right into the kill zone. In the week leading up to the meeting, I prepared. I bought a portable, high-lumen projector and a collapsible screen. I loaded a USB drive with the video file, the lab report summary, hung in a slide showing the statutes of the Clean Water Act, with the penalties, up to $50,000 per day of violation and up to 3 years in prison, highlighted in red. I also reached out to my little coalition of wrong neighbors. I met with Mrs. Gable, the Sanchez's, and the others. I didn't tell them the full extent of my plan or the federal crimes involved. I didn't want to risk a leak. I just told them that I had a plan to confront Karen at the meeting and that I needed their support. "When the time is right," I told them, "I need you to be ready to stand up and tell your stories. Don't be angry, just be factual. State what she did to you and how it made you feel." They were scared, but they were also hopeful. The idea of finally standing up to their tormentor together gave them courage. The night of the annual meeting arrived. The community clubhouse was packed, maybe 50 or 60 people crammed into a stuffy room with fluorescent lighting. Sarah was with me, her hand gripping mine tightly. I carried a discreet black briefcase containing the projector and my laptop. My allied neighbors were scattered throughout the room, a silent network of support. Karen was at the front of the room, sitting at a long table with Arthur the dentist and Brenda the realtor. She was wearing a garish floral pantsuit and a look of supreme self-importance. She banged a gavel on the table, and the meeting began. The first hour was a tedious procession of budgetary reports and committee updates. Karen presided over it all with an iron fist, her voice booming through the cheap PA system. Then, she got to the agenda item listed as old business, property compliance issues. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on me. A small, cruel smile played on her lips. "As you all know," she began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "the board has been working diligently to resolve a long-standing compliance issue with Mr. Miller's property at 124 Miller Creek Road." A murmur went through the crowd. Despite our best efforts to work with Mr. Miller, he has refused to address the hazardous and unaesthetic open water ditch on his property, which violates numerous HOA covenants. She went on for 10 minutes, painting me as a stubborn, uncooperative troublemaker who was single-handedly destroying the neighborhood's character and property values. It was a masterclass in manipulation and lies. I just sat there, my face calm, and us letting her dig her own grave deeper and deeper. Therefore, she concluded, her voice rising to a crescendo, I am calling for a vote. The board proposes levying a special assessment of $20,000 against Mr. Miller's property to cover the costs of forcibly filling the ditch and placing a permanent lien on his property until it is paid. All in favor? Before anyone could raise their hand, I stood up. Point of order, Madam President, I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the room. Every head turned toward me. Karen's face darkened. You are out of order, Mr. Miller. Sit down. Actually, I said, holding up a copy of the HOA bylaws, according to Article 3, Section 4, any member subject to a special assessment has the right to address the community for 5 minutes before a vote is held. I had read the entire binder she'd given me, every single page. She was trapped by her own rules. A flicker of panic crossed her face, but she recovered quickly. Fine, she spat. 5 minutes, make it quick. I didn't walk to the front. I stayed where I was. I don't need 5 minutes, I said. I just have a few pieces of evidence I'd like to share with my neighbors. Sarah, if you would. On cue, Sarah opened the briefcase. I set up the projector on a small table, aimed it at the collapsible screen we placed against a side wall, and plugged in the USB drive. The room was utterly silent. Karen was on her feet now, her face turning a mottled shade of red. What is the meaning of this? This is not approved. It's evidence, Karen, I said calmly, clicking the first file. The video started to play. The image was crystal clear. The dawn light, the ditch, and Karen in her pink tracksuit, upending the bleach jug. A collective gasp went through the room. The video played on a loop, the silent, damning act repeating itself over and over. This footage was taken on Tuesday, May 14th at 5:47 a.m. I announced, my voice like ice. That is our HOA president, Karen Brewster, trespassing on my property and deliberately pouring a chemical agent into my irrigation ditch. I clicked to the next slide. It was the summary of the lab report with the key findings in big bold letters. This is the result of the water analysis from a state-certified lab. The chemical was an industrial-grade bleach containing not only sodium hypochlorite at toxic levels, but also mercury and lead. Another wave of shock rippled through the audience. People were turning to look at Karen, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. Now for the most important part, I said, clicking to the final slide. It showed the map of the ditch flowing into Miller Creek, and next to it, the text of the Clean Water Act. My irrigation ditch, as a matter of public record, flows directly into Miller Creek. Miller Creek is a federally protected waterway. Pouring any pollutant into a tributary of a protected waterway is a federal crime, a felony to be exact, punishable by hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and years in federal prison. I let that sink in. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Karen stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape, her face the color of ash. She looked at Arthur and Brenda, but they stared down at the table, refusing to meet her eyes. Her power had evaporated in the space of 90 seconds. I believe, I said, turning off the projector, that the vote to fine me is no longer relevant. However, I believe we do need to discuss the pattern of harassment and extortion that led to this criminal act. Mrs. Gable, would you be willing to share your experience with the bird feeders? And one by one, my neighbors stood up, their voices shaky but clear, and they told their stories. The dam of fear had broken. The reign of terror was over. The moment Mrs. Gable finished her story, her voice cracking as she described using her meager Social Security income to pay Karen's bogus fines, the room erupted. It wasn't loud or violent. It was a low, angry murmur that grew into a chorus of outrage. People who had been silent for years, who had quietly paid their fines for having the wrong color flowers or leaving their garage door open for too long, were now looking at Karen with open contempt. Mr. Sanchez stood up next, his voice firm. She threatened to fine us into oblivion because our children's playset wasn't beige. She told my wife we were lowering the tone of the neighborhood. My kids heard her. Another neighbor, a quiet man I'd only ever nodded to, stood and spoke about the fines he'd received for his work van, which he needed for his plumbing business. She called me a tradesman, like it was a dirty word, he said, his voice shaking with long-suppressed anger. I'm trying to make a living for my family. The stories kept coming, a flood of petty grievances and major injustices that painted a devastating portrait of a woman drunk on the smallest taste of power. Karen remained at the front table, utterly broken. Her bluster was gone, her authority shattered. She just sat there, shrinking into her floral pantsuit as the community she had tried to dominate turned on her completely. Arthur the dentist and Brenda the realtor looked like they wanted to be swallowed by the floor. They were complicit and they knew it. The faces in the crowd were now looking at them, the silent enablers, and their expressions were just as hard. While the testimonies continued, I discreetly pulled out my phone. I had a number pre-dialed. I stepped into the hallway for a moment, could the angry voices from the meeting room still audible behind me. A calm, professional voice answered on the second ring. Agent Sterling. Agent Sterling, I said, my own voice low and steady. This is Jack Miller. The meeting is underway. The evidence has been presented. She's here. The time is now. We're 2 minutes out, Mr. Miller, he replied. Stay where you are. We'll handle it from here. I walked back into the room just as Mrs. Gable was being comforted by Sarah and another neighbor. I stood by the door waiting. The mood in the room had shifted from anger to a kind of grim determination. Someone called out, "She has to resign. The whole board has to resign." A chorus of "Resign, resign" started to build. Karen looked up, a final desperate flicker of defiance in her eyes. "You have no right," she stammered. "This is my board. I was elected." Just then, the main doors to the clubhouse swung open. 2 men and a woman in dark blue jackets with EPA, Criminal Investigation Division, emblazoned in yellow letters on the back stepped inside. They were flanked by 2 more men in tactical vests with U.S. Marshal across their chests. The room fell instantly, deathly silent. Agent Sterling, the man I'd spoken to on the phone, was in the lead. He was calm, authoritative, and his eyes swept the room before landing on the wreck of a woman at the front table. He held up a badge and a warrant. "Karen Brewster?" he asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. Karen's face went from ashen to chalk white. She looked like she was going to be sick. She could only nod, a pathetic, jerky movement of her head. "You are under arrest," Agent Sterling announced, his voice devoid of any emotion, "for the violation of Title 33, United States Code, Section 1319C, the knowing discharge of a pollutant into a water of the United States." He began to read her the Miranda rights as one of the other agents stepped behind her and placed her hands behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed in the silent room. It was a sound of absolute finality. No one spoke. No one moved. Everyone just watched as Karen Brewster, the tyrant of Oak Hollow Estates, was transformed from an all-powerful HOA president into a federal criminal defendant. Her face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. This wasn't supposed to happen. Her world of petty rules and fines had just collided with the full, unyielding force of federal law. As they let her out, she passed by me. Her eyes met mine for a fleeting second. There was no anger in them, no defiance, only a vast, empty bewilderment. She had sown the wind, and now she was reaping a whirlwind she couldn't even begin to comprehend. After she was gone, Agent Sterling addressed the room. "We will be conducting a full investigation," he said. "We may need to speak with some of you as witnesses. For now, this meeting is concluded." He then turned to Arthur and Brenda. "You two, don't go anywhere. We need a word." The crowd began to disperse, not in a rush, but slowly, quietly, as if waking from a long nightmare. People came up to me, one by one. They didn't cheer or celebrate. They just shook my hand or clapped me on the shoulder. An elderly man I'd never met before, with tears in his eyes, simply said, "Thank you." Mrs. Gable gave me a fierce, surprising hug. "You gave us our neighborhood back, Jack," she whispered. Sarah came to my side and wrapped her arms around me. I could feel her trembling. "It's over," I murmured into her hair. "It's finally over." We watched as Arthur and Brenda were questioned by one of the EPA agents. Their faces were pale with terror. Their complicity had a cost, and the bill was coming due. They would later both resign from the board in disgrace and agree to cooperate fully with the investigation in exchange for avoiding charges themselves. The HOA, as it had existed under Karen, was dead. The fight had been long and draining. It had stolen the peace I had come here to find. But as I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, at the sense of shared relief and newfound community, I realized I had found something else instead. I hadn't just defended my property, and I had liberated a community, and that was a mission worth fighting for. The aftermath of what the neighbors started calling the Great Takedown was swift and decisive. Karen's arrest sent shockwaves through the entire county. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly Oak Hollow Estates was famous for all the wrong reasons. The headline read, HOA president arrested on federal environmental charges. The story detailed her campaign of harassment and the dramatic confrontation at the annual meeting. My name was kept out of it, at my request. I wasn't looking for fame, I was looking for peace, and it was finally within my grasp. Karen Brewster was released on bail, but her reign was unequivocally over. She was facing multiple felony counts. The EPA's investigation was thorough. They took their own samples to confirm the lab's findings and used my video and the neighbors' testimonies to build an ironclad case. The presence of heavy metals in the bleach she used was a significant aggravating factor, elevating the severity of the crime. Marcus kept me updated on the legal proceedings. She's trying to claim it was just a mistake, he told me over the phone one day, a note of amusement in his voice. Her lawyer's arguing she thought it was just a dirty puddle, not a waterway. My video of her standing right next to the flowing creek as she pours it in makes that a tough sell. And your testimony about her fixation on the ditch for months beforehand establishes clear intent. The HOA was in chaos. With Karen arrested and Arthur and Brenda resigning in disgrace, the board was effectively dissolved. A special meeting was called, not by a president with a gavel, but by the community itself. I attended, but I didn't speak. I just listened. The tone was completely different. People were talking, collaborating, and brainstorming. They wanted to rewrite the bylaws, to strip them of the petty, cosmetic nonsense, and focus only on essential maintenance and shared resources. They wanted term limits for board members and an independent oversight committee. They were building something new from the ashes of Karen's tyranny. I was nominated to lead the new interim board. I politely declined. I'm a farmer, not a politician, I told them, but I'll help in any way I can. Instead, Mrs. Gable, emboldened and full of a new fire, was elected as the interim president. Her first official act was to draft a resolution formally apologizing to all the families who had been unjustly fined and to create a fund to reimburse them all with interest. The Sanchez family's playset remained a vibrant, multicolored beacon of childhood joy in their backyard. Bird feeders of all shapes and sizes began appearing in gardens throughout the neighborhood. It was a quiet, beautiful rebellion. My apple orchard became the biggest project. The bleach had done significant damage. I lost about a dozen of the youngest saplings, the ones closest to the ditch. Their leaves had withered, and their roots were too badly burned by the caustic chemicals. It was a painful loss, a physical reminder of the venom that had been directed at us. But the older, more established trees, while stressed, showed signs of recovery. I spent weeks flushing the ditch with clean water, working with agricultural extension agents to amend the soil and mitigate the long-term damage from the heavy metals. It was hard, expensive work, but it was healing work. My neighbors helped. Mr. Sanchez, who worked in construction, brought over a small excavator and helped me carefully remove the most contaminated soil from the ditch banks. Mrs. Gable and other gardeners brought over bags of organic compost and mycorrhizal fungi to help rejuvenate the soil's microbiome. People would just show up with thermoses of coffee, with sandwiches, or just to offer a word of encouragement. The ditch, which had been the source of so much conflict, became a symbol of our community's recovery. It was no longer just my ditch, it was our ditch. 6 months later, Karen Brewster's case went to court. She pled guilty to a lesser charge to avoid a trial she knew she couldn't win. She was convicted of one felony count of negligently discharging a pollutant into a water of the United States. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, a $75,000 fine, and 500 hours of community service, which she was ordered to perform with a state park environmental cleanup crew. She was also forced to pay me restitution for the cost of the dead trees and the soil remediation, a sum that amounted to just over $30,000. And as a convicted felon, she was barred for life from ever serving on any corporate or nonprofit board, including any HOA, ever again. She and her husband sold their house at a loss and moved away. I never saw her again. The final piece of justice was a civil suit Marcus filed on behalf of myself, Mrs. Gable, the Sanchez's, White, and 10 other families against the HOA's insurance company. Faced with the mountain of evidence of gross negligence and willful misconduct, the insurer settled out of court. The settlement was substantial enough to cover all of our legal fees, fully reimburse everyone for the bogus fines, and create a surplus that the new HOA board used to replant my lost apple trees and build a small, beautiful public garden near the clubhouse entrance, complete with benches and, of course, several bird feeders. One cool autumn evening, about a year after it all began, I was walking through my orchard. The new saplings planted by the community were taking root. The older trees were heavy with their first real crop of apples. The air smelled of ripe fruit and crisp leaves. The water in the ditch flowed clear and clean, me catching the golden light of the setting sun. Sarah came and stood beside me, and we watched the water flow by in comfortable silence. The peace I had been searching for wasn't a place without conflict. I had learned that such a place doesn't exist. Peace, I realized, was the quiet confidence that comes from standing your ground. It was the strength of a community that refuses to be bullied. It was the simple, profound satisfaction of seeing justice done and order restored. I looked at the water, the lifeblood of my land, and I thought about Karen. I didn't feel anger or even satisfaction anymore. I just felt a kind of detached pity. She had tried to poison my dream, but in the end, the only thing she had truly destroyed was herself. My dream was still here, stronger and more vibrant than ever, nurtured by clean water and the goodwill of the very neighbors she had tried to set me against. And that was a victory sweeter than any apple I would ever grow.